It was supposed to be a standard celebrity interview. 45 minutes, maybe an hour. A few questions about the new album, a few laughs about the Bodyguard, and a gracious goodbye. Oprah Winfrey had done thousands of them. She knew exactly how they went, and she was very good at making them feel like something more than they were. That was her gift. That was what separated her from every other interviewer in America. She made famous people feel seen. She made audiences feel like they were sitting in the room. And she always knew when someone was lying to her. Not in a malicious way, but in the way that almost every celebrity lied. By performing a version of themselves that had been carefully rehearsed, polished, and approved by a team of publicists before it ever reached a microphone. But the moment Whitney Houston walked onto that stage in the fall of 1993, something shifted. Oprah felt it before she could name it. There was something behind those eyes, something careful and exhausted and desperately hidden, that made her set down her index cards after the first commercial break and decide quietly to go somewhere nobody had planned to go. What happened in the next 40 minutes would change how America understood its greatest singer. And what Oprah did after the cameras stopped rolling is a story that has never been fully told. Until now. By 1993, Whitney Houston was not just famous. She was something beyond famous. A phenomenon the English language barely had adequate words to describe. The Bodyguard soundtrack had sold over 40 million copies worldwide. I Will Always Love You had shattered every chart record imaginable, sitting at #1 for 14 consecutive weeks. She had performed at the Super Bowl. She had collected Grammys like other people collected parking tickets. Her face was on the cover of every magazine that mattered. Her voice, that supernatural, God-given instrument that her mother Sissy had always said was not truly Whitney's to own, but only Whitney's to borrow, was the most recognizable sound in the world. You could play 3 notes of any Whitney Houston song in any country on earth, and people would stop walking. People would close their eyes. People would, without quite knowing why, feel something loosen in their chests. But that morning, backstage at Harpo Studios in Chicago, the woman sitting in the makeup chair was not a phenomenon. She was 30 years old. She was tired in the particular way that only people who have been performing for other people since childhood understand. A tiredness that sleep cannot touch. A depletion that goes all the way down to something that doesn't have a medical name. Her publicist stood nearby, running through approved talking points with the quiet efficiency of someone defusing a bomb. The new album, the tour, the marriage. Bobby. Always Bobby. Now. The question of Bobby. The weight of Bobby. The impossible public arithmetic of Bobby Brown and Whitney Houston that everyone in America seemed to feel entitled to an opinion on. Just keep it light, the publicist had said that morning for what felt like the 100th time. She's going to try to go deep. That's what she does. Just keep it light. Whitney had nodded. She was good at nodding. She had been nodding at instructions since she was 7 years old, singing in the choir at New Hope Baptist Church in Newark, when her mother would stand at the front of the room and correct her breathing, her posture, her vowels. There was always someone telling Whitney Houston what to do with the instrument that lived inside her. There was always someone who knew better. She had learned very early that the path of least resistance was to nod and then sing exactly the way she wanted to sing anyway. But lately, the nodding had started to cost her something. Lately, the gap between the woman she performed being and the woman she actually was had grown wide enough that standing in it felt genuinely dangerous. Oprah watched Whitney walk through the curtain and knew immediately that she was looking at someone carrying something enormous. She had seen it before. She had seen it in women who came on her show after surviving things that should not be survived. She had seen it in men who held themselves with the particular rigid dignity of people who had decided, somewhere along the way, that showing pain was a form of weakness they could not afford. She had seen it in children occasionally, which was always the worst. That ancient heaviness in young eyes. But she had rarely seen it quite this clearly in someone who was, by every external measure, at the absolute apex of human success. Whitney Houston had everything, and she was sitting 10 feet away from Oprah Winfrey, looking like a woman who had not slept properly in years. The first 20 minutes went exactly as the publicist had hoped. Oprah was warm and funny. Whitney was warm and funny back. They talked about the Bodyguard, about working with Kevin Costner, about the scene that had required 17 takes because Whitney kept laughing. They talked about the album. Whitney sang a few lines of something a cappella, and the studio audience went so loud that a producer in the control booth had to ask them twice to quiet down. Everything was smooth. Everything was polished. Everything was exactly what it was supposed to be. But then Oprah put down her index cards. It was a small gesture. In 20 years of filming, her production team had come to understand that when Oprah put down her index cards, something real was about to happen. The camera operators adjusted their angles instinctively. The floor director took a small step backward. And the publicist, standing just off stage, felt a cold understanding move through her that she was no longer in control of the next 30 minutes. "Can I ask you something?" Oprah said, and her voice had changed. Not dramatically, not in a way the audience could easily identify, but in the way that a key changes when you turn it from a lock. It had gone from television warm to human warm, which is a completely different thing. "And you don't have to answer it. I mean that genuinely. But I've been sitting here for 20 minutes and I keep thinking about something my grandmother used to say. She used to say you can always tell when a person is singing their real song and when they're singing someone else's." Whitney was very still. "And I'm sitting here watching you," Oprah continued, "and I'm thinking, when was the last time you sang your real song? Not in a studio, not on a stage. I mean in your actual life. When was the last time you just were?" The studio was very quiet, not the polite quiet of a well-behaved audience following instructions, the deep quiet of a room full of people who had collectively stopped breathing. Whitney looked at Oprah for a long moment, and then she did something that her publicist, watching from the wings, had never seen her do in front of a camera. She stopped performing. It was visible as a physical change, a slight drop in the shoulders, a release somewhere around the jaw, a shift in the eyes from the bright, focused light of a woman who was being Whitney Houston to something older and more private and real. It lasted only a second, but Oprah caught it, the cameras caught it, and the studio audience, all 300 of them, caught it too. "God," Whitney said softly, and she laughed. Not her public laugh, the one that was big and warm and invited everyone to laugh along with her, but a small, private laugh, the kind that surfaces when someone has said something so accurate that your only defense is to acknowledge it sideways. "God, Oprah." "You don't have to answer," Oprah said again. "No, Whitney stopped. She looked at her hands. When she looked up, her eyes were bright in a way that had nothing to do with stage lighting. "My mama used to say that my voice was the Holy Spirit moving through me, and for a long time I really believed that. I mean, I felt it. You know how there are some times when you're singing and it's not even you anymore? It's something bigger moving through you and you're just trying to stay out of its way?" She paused. "I don't feel that as much anymore." The audience was completely silent, not because they were being polite, because no one wanted to interrupt what was happening. "I don't know when that changed," Whitney said. "I don't know exactly when I started singing for the numbers, for the reviews, for all of it. I love performing. I genuinely love it. But somewhere in there it got complicated. There's a version of me that people need me to be, and I work very hard to be that. And sometimes I don't know." She stopped again, pressed her lips together. "I don't know where she ends and I start." What Oprah did next was not what any television producer would have recommended. She didn't pivot. She didn't lighten the moment. She didn't smile reassuringly and steer the conversation towards safer ground. She sat in the silence for a full 6 seconds, which, on live television, is an eternity, and let Whitney's words exist in the room without immediately trying to resolve them. "I know," Oprah said finally. And the way she said it was not the performative empathy of a practiced interviewer. It was the recognition of a woman who had spent years building a public self so convincing that she sometimes lost track of the private one. "I know exactly what you mean." Those 4 words did something to Whitney Houston that 40 million album sales had not done. They found a crack in the careful architecture she had been constructing for 15 years and let a little light through. Her eyes filled. She pressed her fingers briefly to her mouth, and in that moment, the studio audience, 300 strangers in Chicago felt something rare and almost sacred. The privilege of witnessing a woman who had spent her entire adult life being magnificent allow herself for just a moment to be human. The interview went another 20 minutes after that. They didn't solve anything. They didn't arrive at a neat conclusion, but something true had been said, and in a world where truth had become one of Whitney's rarest commodities, that mattered enormously. What nobody saw was what happened after. After the cameras stopped and the audience filed out, after the production crew began dismantling cables and lighting rigs, after the publicist rushed onto the stage with the expression of a woman who had just survived a natural disaster. After all of that, Oprah walked over to where Whitney was still sitting and sat down next to her on the stage floor. Not in a chair, on the floor. Two women, one of them the most powerful person in television, and the other the most successful recording artist in the world, sitting on the floor of a studio in Chicago. "She just sat with me," Whitney would tell a close friend much later, describing the moment in the quiet, wondering way she described things that had genuinely surprised her. "She didn't ask me anything else. She didn't tell me to get help or call someone or whatever. She just sat with me for almost an hour. And we talked about our mamas. We talked about what it's like when your voice is the thing people need from you, and sometimes you don't know if you have any more of it left to give. And for that hour, I felt like a person, not a voice, not a brand, just a person." What Oprah told her that afternoon was something she had never said publicly. She told Whitney about the years when she had eaten in secret and wept in secret and hidden the truest parts of herself so thoroughly that she had occasionally woken in the night, unable to remember what those parts felt like. She told her about the particular loneliness of being someone that other people need to be invincible. And she told her, carefully without prescription, that the voice and the woman were not the same thing, that the world needed the voice, but the woman needed the world too. "Don't let the voice swallow the woman," Oprah told her. "The world has plenty of voices, but there's only one you." Whitney Houston left Chicago that afternoon in a car that took her to a hotel where she sat alone before her team arrived. By all accounts, she ordered room service. She called her mother. She watched television until she fell asleep, which she said later was the most uncomplicated thing she had done in months. The interview aired that Friday. By Saturday morning, it had become the most talked about television moment of the year. Critics wrote about the crack in the armor, the glimpse behind the curtain. They were not wrong exactly, but they missed the most important part, which is that what surfaced was not a tragedy, not a warning, not a story of a woman in crisis. It was a woman remembering very briefly that she was a woman, not a voice, not an icon. A woman from Newark named Whitney, who had grown up singing in church because she felt something moving through her bigger than herself, and who had spent 15 years trying to build a public life worthy of that feeling, without understanding that the feeling and the life were not the same thing. The broadcast nurse at a children's hospital in Atlanta watched that interview in the break room at 11 o'clock on a Friday night, still in her scrubs after a 14-hour shift. Her name was Clara James, and she was 26 years old, and she had been having the particular crisis of faith that strikes certain caregivers in their second year. The moment when the idealism that sustained them through training runs up against the hard mathematics of a healthcare system that moves too fast and pays too little and asks too much. She had been thinking for several weeks about leaving, about doing something easier, about finding a life that did not require her to be someone's source of comfort on the worst day of that person's existence. And then she watched Whitney Houston, the most successful singer alive, sit on a television stage in Chicago and say quietly that she did not always know where the gift ended and she began. And Clara James sat in that break room for a long time after the credits rolled, thinking about a patient she had cared for the week before, a 7-year-old girl named Maya, recovering from a bone marrow transplant, who had asked Clara to hum something while she held her hand during a procedure that Clara knew would hurt. Clara had hummed the first thing that came to mind, which happened to be the opening bars of Greatest Love of All. Maya had closed her eyes, held Clara's hand very tightly, and when it was over, she opened her eyes and said, "You have a pretty hum." Sitting in that break room, Clara understood something she had not quite grasped before, that the gift and the giver were not separable, that you could not pour yourself into the work and keep yourself back from it, that the very thing that made the work costly was the thing that made it matter. She did not leave nursing. She spent the next 30 years in pediatric oncology, and she became one of the most beloved nurses in her department. And she never forgot the Friday night she sat in a break room in Atlanta and heard a woman with the greatest voice in the world say that sometimes she couldn't find herself inside it. That is what Oprah saw on the stage in Chicago in 1993. Not a superstar in crisis, a woman who needed for 1 hour to be told that the woman mattered as much as the voice. She gave her that hour. She sat on the floor and gave her that hour. And somewhere in Atlanta and in 1,000 other places where people were watching alone in the dark, something shifted, quietly, without ceremony, the way the most important things always do. Whitney Houston left us too soon. She left a silence that the world has not entirely filled. But in that Chicago studio on a fall afternoon in 1993, she left something else too. The image of a woman sitting very still on a television stage, her eyes bright, her voice quiet, speaking a truth that had nothing to do with music, and a woman beside her who had the wisdom to put down her index cards and listen. That is the story nobody fully told. That is what happened when the camera stopped. That is the real interview, the one that lasted an hour on a studio floor, with no crew, no audience, no index cards. Just two women from very different places who had both learned, at great cost, what it means to build a public life so convincing that you sometimes forget there was ever anything else. Whitney sang her real song that afternoon, not into a microphone, not to an audience of millions, just to one person sitting next to her on the floor. And it was, by any honest accounting, one of the finest performances of her life.